Welcome back to Good Revenue. We're here today continuing our series on AI and machine learning. We'll explore the rapidly evolving AI landscape from DeepSeek's market-moving claims to enterprise AI adoption and the tensions between optimistic market projections and sobering risk assessments. We're joined by Tali Bray, a former CIO from Wells Fargo. Welcome, Tali. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you, Neeta. So happy to be here.
Let's start with a story that's been making waves in the AI world. DeepSeek, which was built by a Chinese hedge fund, recently claimed that they trained their AI model for just $6 million, which is a fraction of what major American companies spend. This has sparked an intense debate in the industry. Some of the highlights at Davos, the CEO of Scale AI said that DeepSeek actually had 50,000 NVIDIA chips that they were not disclosing. In the Financial Times, OpenAI accused DeepSeek of violating its terms of service by using distillation to create its model. Anthropic's Dario Amodei said, DeepSeek does not do for $6 million what costs AI companies in the US billions. And if the 50,000 chips were used, the training costs were actually $1 billion, which is similar to US firms. In other news, NASA, the Pentagon, and several governments have blocked use of DeepSeek. At the same time, Microsoft and Amazon have integrated these models. So it's a really interesting landscape. How do you interpret this clash between the claims and the pushback? And what do you think might be happening beneath the surface?
For me, what I am taking away is we are in this moment where this belief that we've been carrying around for the past couple of years that the future of AI will be controlled by basically 4 or 5 companies led by 4 to 5 men. I don't think it's an inevitability. And I think what DeepSeek did was spark this conversation that we are in this moment where there's an opportunity for companies to come in and potentially add competition, add new approaches, new techniques, new technology in a way that will potentially broaden the playing field. We know that this is a very small window. It won't last forever. But that idea that we are not in this moment of inevitability, for me, is extremely exciting. You have to look at the training investment versus total investment. Yes, all of those things I think are true, but there is this opportunity, this brief windows, I think, for companies to achieve similar results in reasoning capabilities. Sam Altman's concern about the evidence of distillation, where developers are attaining better results on smaller models by training on outputs of larger models, and that it violates their terms of use. I find a certain amount of irony in that because, of course, we all know how OpenAI was trained and many of the active lawsuits about copyright infringement, et cetera. So I think that is an entirely separate and very interesting topic about who owns the data. The other thing that's very interesting is if you look at where DeepSeek has been really successful, right, it's much more specific tasks, reasoning, math, engineering, and is probably more comparable to OpenAI 4. So I don't know that it's fundamentally different. There was a Wired article recently that talked about the lessons we're learning from automakers. In this article, Helpel was quoted saying the Chinese industry benefits from blurrier lines between government, private firms, and military. That made me think immediately of Stargate and the $500 billion that has been invested in this AI infrastructure project with OpenAI, SoftBank, and then Oracle as a primary investor supported by the U.S. government. The U.S. government is not a direct investor, but they are pledging access to electricity for the very energy-intensive data centers, streamlining regulatory hurdles, and also access to some federal land use. So I do think that it's going to be very interesting to see how these models around convergence of government, private industry, I don't think in the US it will be military, but given our geopolitical landscape, who knows what's going to happen. There is something to be said in that, particularly as we look at the massive amount of infrastructure compute and associated energy and land required to do. I think there are legitimate concerns about security.
One around your point about distillation, I think is well taken. I think that irony is not lost on a lot of people observing this. Small data models is just this, right? That it's the idea of you are siphoning off or skimming off the top of these deeper models to do work. But I think a lot of people assume that would happen within an organization, not necessarily from a state actor or a non-state actor.
Yeah.
One of the questions I had for you too is, given that China's data sovereignty laws are very different from the United States, the CCP claims ownership of all data that hits its servers, even after a user deletes something they might have searched for through DeepSeek. How do you think organizations should balance that access to innovation, that competitive spirit, with important issues that you also touched on in terms of the sensitivity of data and IP issues? Obviously, we have had a historic challenge dealing with CCP's sponsored activity. Almost all American companies at this point have been hacked and IP has been taken. What do you think?
So I think that is one of the most fundamental questions, and it touches on everything: geopolitical relationships, responsible, ethical AI. When we operate on a global ecosystem and we're leveraging products that are generated and controlled in geographies with completely different data governing pieces from a US perspective, where we tend to focus on European and US-based data privacy. When we think about ownership of data, the enterprise needs to own its proprietary data, right? That is customer data, internal metrics, any interactions between employees, customers, and systems that they have as it drives insights for AI development. This ensures that our data privacy and compliance laws are adhered to, and the companies retain control over how it's used. When we think about AI models and algorithms, those that are custom built for a specific business need, for example, predictive models, agentics, the enterprise has to own their own models. What becomes interesting is, and this is a conversation we've been having for years about social, if a company is using off-the-shelf AI tools or platforms and ownership is more shared, I think the provider clearly owns the platform, but the enterprise owns the application and the outcomes. Regardless of what you may be integrating with, the ownership and the accountability for the outcomes and the application resides solely with the organization. Ultimately, the enterprise should always hold accountability for the outcomes of the AI that they are implementing, even if the third-party solution is used. Ultimately, the companies, the users have to be responsible that AI is used ethically, effectively, aligned with its goals, values, which means if you are working with AI platforms and tools governed by entities and bodies outside of the US, I do believe it's ultimately the company's responsibility to ensure that data privacy adhere to US standards, particularly for US residents using it. So if there are concerns, for example, that DeepSeek, CCP, retains all data, even after it's used, it's ultimately any company in the US who's using that responsibility to mitigate that and ensure that it is complying with the US privacy laws.
So let's pivot a little bit. We'll talk about AI agents. I wanted to define a couple terms for the audience. Feel free to disagree if you don't agree with these ones. But AI agents I'm defining as autonomous systems capable of sensing, learning, and acting upon their environments to achieve specific goals. And agentic AI is autonomous generative AI, another term that's been thrown around quite a bit in the last several months. Is there anything you would add to that?
I think that's fair. When we think about agentics, it's really the ability for AI to be optimized for specific tasks. Mm-hmm. And to be optimized for specific tasks, you typically have a proprietary knowledge base that resides within your organization.
There was a notable surge in generative AI pilot projects all over the enterprise. There were a lot of concerns about the high costs of experimentation and whether or not there were real benefits. A lot of companies, I'm sure Wells Fargo was among them, started talking more about and focusing more on business outcomes, on enhancing data quality, talent development, some of these other issues. According to Deloitte, $2 billion has been invested in this space over the last 2 years. In your view, how are all of these AI pilots going? We hear a lot about pilots being started or being underway. And I'm not sure that I've heard that much about the results or outcomes from those pilots.
Are there any enterprises where a business model has fundamentally shifted, where
Right.
customer engagements have fundamentally shifted? I don't purport to know the answer to that, but what I have observed for most enterprises, large enterprises, what I see is there is still a focus on efficiency, fundamentally cost reduction. So let's take operational processes and make them more efficient. Let's look at agentics as the next evolution in robotics. We have had robotics for many years. This is a more intuitive, effective way for robotics to bring lift to the enterprise. That's still around efficiency and savings. If we think about so many of the use cases in operations, contact centers, things where you have a lot of humans engaging in repetitive tasks or relatively simple tasks, many of the pilots are around how do we add agents to make our human agents more effective so they're not potentially sifting through thousands of different sources of data to answer a very simple question. That's still around efficiency, ultimately, which companies are looking at saving money on their bottom lines. When you think about companies that have fundamentally shifted a business model, the obvious ones that come to mind are entertainment, Netflix, Spotify, how they're leveraging AI to drive personalization, which can drive revenue. I think that there are a lot of investments in pilots, but I haven't seen a significant shift in business model, product, service that is really driving top line revenue. I just saw a study from PwC, roughly 38% of CEOs see positive result from their AI initiatives from a revenue perspective. So I'm very curious, who are those 38 CEOs and what specifically are they driving? I think there's still a tremendous amount to be done before we actually see significant shift from these pilots. The reality is the investment has to be made though right now. Every company really needs to think about how ultimately work is being restructured. And what I see in so many of these pilots is technology making process more efficient, not fundamentally shifting how we define work, what the workload is for an individual. And so it's making what we already have better, smarter, faster, without fundamentally thinking about how does this shift the actual nature of work in our organization. Fundamentally, for companies, I still believe people is a competitive advantage. I know there are articles now about one-person unicorns. AI will enable that solopreneur unicorn opportunity. If we don't have a culture and we don't define the work structure in a way that optimizes what people bring, which is judgment, nuance, empathy, creativity, idea generation, we're going to miss out on the true value that this emerging technology can bring. Everybody knows AI is not new. Gen AI was a breakthrough. LLMs are a breakthrough. But a lot of this is still applying technology to what we already know. I think about Amazon back in the day. We're a bookseller. We're going to do what bookstores do. We're going to do it virtually. And then they evolved into a completely different business model. I'm still waiting to see a company that has this thought of, okay, I'm going to be more efficient. Now I'm going to evolve into a fundamentally different business model.
What's interesting about the Amazon model is it's well known now that Jeff Bezos had this broader vision, and he was savvy enough to realize that if he focused it on book selling, that he'd be able to build that infrastructure and then move into other markets. And I agree with you. It's not as clear to me that there are specific outcomes or business model transformations tied to this. Part of why I think there is probably less direct ROI in the short term than what we're hearing from AI advocates is that the data around misinformation and the lack of accuracy in these generative AI models is still pretty profound. Another piece of news around DeepSeek was that both OpenAI and Microsoft noted that DeepSeek made the same hallucinations as ChatGPT. It's one of the ways that they knew that this model was distilled. And according to a watchdog called NewsGuard, 10 of the leading chatbots collectively failed 62% of the time, and they continue to repeat false claims and offer non-responses. And what I find interesting is that this decline in performance, they say, is the highest recorded fail rate since July 2024. And they attribute that to the fact that there are a lot of new features and enhancements that have been rolled out in a short period of time. But the question I have more for the enterprise is, if all of this is foundationally tied to these models that ultimately can't tell you what is true or not, doesn't that inherently limit their application and their utility in the enterprise? Part of what you're saying with some of the incremental applications, the efficiency applications make a lot of sense to me. But the more transformative, we're not going to need any humans anymore, we're just going to have robots, feels like a limiting factor we are probably not going to hit with this technology. Now, there might be some other technology, or maybe we're careening into the Terminator. I don't know. I hope not, but it's possible. At the rate we are currently going, anything is possible. Do you think we're ever going to solve for these problems? Because if we don't, I'm a little unclear as to how we're going to significantly transform the enterprise or huge business models or other things that we really rely on humans for. So I see the incremental efficiency, the improvements, the optimizations. The idea that there'll be no humans in the enterprise feels unrealistic for good reasons, maybe.
Large language models really replicate conversation, thinking, reasoning. They are theoretically based on the corpus knowledge of humanity. We know they are based on everything that has been digitized. And we know what has been digitized is not remotely the sort of corpus of knowledge of humanity. We know it is biased by geography, language, gender, all of these things. So I think we need to acknowledge and understand that any organization that is thinking about leveraging an LLM is most likely doing that with some sort of augmented smaller data model that represents their corporate information. So I think the way many organizations are looking at that is saying, okay, allow the LLM to be the conversational interface. That organization will use the LLM to manage and translate that conversation. But it's also going to tell the LLM, now go to my own vector database, which has my company-specific information. Only seek an answer from that information. Here are the parameters from which you can interact, and now respond using language. So I think that combination of the broader LLM, just to translate natural communication with company-specific information in corporate settings, is going to reduce some of the risk around hallucination.
Could we get a little deeper into that? Because what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me in a use case like fraud detection for a bank or analyzing healthcare tests or radiology work. That makes a lot of sense. And that is because LLMs are probabilistic, right? And so they are doing a better job of pattern matching. And while it looks like a prediction to us, it's not really that. They're actually running the analysis to figure out what is most likely, which is something that they are actually better at than we are as humans, right? It's work where understanding the patterns really pays off. Unlike some of the questions around ideation and innovation and what is new, which to your point, these are tied to what has been, and they're not a perfect understanding of that either. They include all of the bias and the weights of the information that we have on the internet, right? Most, even huge internet aficionados would not say that the web is neutral or impartial. I think maybe it's just having my mind wrap around that. I could see all of this coming out of other types of artificial intelligence. I find it hard to believe that this is all going to necessarily come out of generative AI.
So Gen AI built on LLMs is one very specific form of AI, right? I think AGI, this broader idea of general intelligence, is still evolving and maturing. When I think about corporate settings, and most organizations have some sort of mission, value system, core products and services, they will have a significant amount of data resident to their specific domain and their customers. So using an LLM to interface with that controlled information where there is understanding and trust, I think is a way to minimize hallucination and inaccurate information. That being said, take a bank as an example. There is also an understanding that if you look at all historical data, there is bias in lending decisions, right? There is bias in fraud decisions. So those organizations also have to look at their data and track for bias so they can clean that up and protect against that. as it relates to just in general, when I use ChatGPT, when I use Claude, when I use Gemini, and I am asking a basic question, I'm looking for an innovative idea, I want help doing market research, it is quite likely possible that errors will come into, or hallucinations will come into that based not only on the language model itself, but how inference, predictive reasoning, all of those actually work. So, as I've always maintained, there is a huge sticker when any of us as consumers use this technology, buyer beware. And it's another reason why I think it is so essential that we have diversity in the organizations working on the LLMs, training the LLMs, looking at accuracy. Without that set of diverse eyes, experiences, lived experiences, looking at this information, what we saw in the early days, representational harm in the outputs of these models. So this is not flawed because the sets of data that are being worked on are not perfect and not fully representative. And the people that are training those models can work with their own biases. So I do think it's absolutely essential that all of these organizations have a fundamental commitment to looking for bias within the people that are training and engaging on these represent a wide variety of lived experiences. I think diversity is extremely smart, strategic business sense. There's significant indisputable data that organizations with more diverse workforces, regardless of whether you're talking about racial, ethnic, gender, cognitive focus, personality style, are more innovative and have higher returns. I think that's something we need to extend as we think about AI for all of the reasons we just discussed. How do we ensure that we are making decisions or we're training these tools to make decisions that identify and avoid historical biases?
I think these are really important issues. And I agree with you. There's a lot of independent research to support what you're saying about the breadth and value of diverse perspectives and how they really drive shareholder outcomes and create value. However, it is also a time when a lot of that work is under attack, obviously, in the federal government and in some enterprises and large corporations. It's no longer a given. That is even the North Star of how we're building and tuning AI. That in many ways adds to my concerns about what is it that we're actually doing here. And I know there's not an easy way to answer this on a podcast, but the wider context in which this work is being done and knowing a little bit about some of the stakeholders that are strongly advocating for it, I tend to be skeptical. I just don't see this history of accountability when things go wrong, or even an acknowledgement that this might not be a solution that works for everyone. We might just be talking about a chatbot. But on the other hand, these are foundational, fundamental questions, right? If you're treating customers differently or employees differently, or to your point, suddenly the way that you're analyzing what employees are doing on your servers might impact their job potential or their success. Within both management and the board, what do you think the key criteria should be as to how the board or management evaluate AI, whether it is Gen AI or whether it's predictive AI or any of these other technologies?
I just want to share something that I think one of the superheroes in AI in the field of human-centered AI, Dr. Lee, who's the co-director of Stanford's Human-Centered AI Institute, said, "There is nothing artificial about artificial intelligence. It is made by people, used by people, and needs to be governed by people." And I think it is really important that we always remember that, because who is doing the governing impacts everything. Back to my earlier comments about inevitability, I do not believe that we are down an inevitable path. And I think it's incredibly important that stakeholders, shareholders, consumers insist to understand how our products that are using AI in organizations being developed, being governed. So I agree with everything you're saying. I have extreme concern. This is my whole proceed with caution, like warning label. But I believe that there's a way that this can be addressed. If people insist that it is done so. Consumers, if we are informed and active, have a significant opportunity to influence. Okay, so board. What should board members be thinking about? How should they evaluate this? So what I would say first and foremost is, as a board, as a CEO, you must have a North Star. As you think about how you're going to leverage and integrate AI into your organization, you must have a North Star. You must be very clear on what your mission is, what your values are, and then where you are focused on growth. I like to think myself, as I work with an AI system, I am training it, and it is also training me. And that is all about how do we deconstruct really complex ideas or deconstruct hypotheses through a series of intelligent questions. I obviously can drive innovation and efficiency, but it's really critical that these CEOs and boards are thinking about the ethical concerns, data privacy, the need for skilled talent to implement and manage AI effectively. Do you have the right staff? Are you clear on what your North Star is, your vision, and where you think your business model can either shift potentially and or reach much greater efficiencies, which will allow you to reinvest? I was just actually talking with a company about this that operates outside of the US, supporting real estate transactions. The question was, okay, as we think about bringing in AI, should we be looking at building out our own small models? Should we be leveraging small models that we can license? Should we be thinking about large services from large vendors? So those questions, it's a sort of proverbial build or buy, are extremely critical for CEOs, board members, executives to be thinking about, also because of what we talked about before. I think there is an exuberance, potentially almost an irrational exuberance, to race to adopt without understanding fundamentally what the purpose is. One way that companies can start that race to adopt without foolish investment or unsound investment is to start just experimenting with the tools with small hypotheses without making major big bet investments. A lot of that also is ensuring that your workforce knows how to use this technology. We are entering into a time where the human tech partnership is going to take on more significance than it historically has. We are able to amplify our intelligence. We're able to create super agents out of one. So for organizations to be thinking about this, the piece that I feel is consistently missed is, what are you trying to solve?
I think what you're also alluding to is a little bit of the risk piece of this. There's a taxonomy that MIT has developed that has 777 risks in it, which is so interesting. It's an analysis of a lot of other work that's out there. I think it focuses on something like 43 different reports. Do you think enterprises are actually capturing the risks correctly right now? And is there something they could do differently if they're not?
So my general sense on my observation experience is no, because I think the focus right now very much is on data, compliance, privacy, which is absolutely essential. I think there is much less, and in some cases, no focus on thinking about workforce, restructuring work, ensuring that there is a strategy around talent development, talent acquisition, because I think we are far from moving to that solo entrepreneur unicorn. So I think that aspect is often underlooked. I don't remember who said this, the phrase, strategy culture eats strategy for lunch, is very much applicable here as well.
One of the other topics that we wanted to get into today was what I also think might be a really interesting unintended consequence of having all this AI running around. It seems like it might have some implications for the business model of SaaS itself. They're speaking of culture eating strategy. This would basically be like AI eating tech. According to Satya Nadella on a very long podcast back in December with Bill Gurley, he discussed at length his thinking around how AI could replace traditional business logic in SaaS applications. So this is very much in your wheelhouse. But the idea that if you're able to consolidate back-end systems and suddenly there is an AI or multiple AIs managing rules and data and information across these systems or within systems, I think this raises some really interesting questions. If you were still at Wells Fargo or any other large company, you undoubtedly would want to make sure that your organization retained agency over the AI agents or over if it's AGI or whatever it is, right? Like you would want that primacy.
Yes.
And so I think there's questions of who owns the robots. One of the ones that was foremost in my mind, at least, is where does the AI agency reside? Is it with the vendor or the customer? Every enterprise that I can think of has a lot of different SaaS applications all over, right? Front office and back office operations, manufacturing, all sorts of things. So what happens when AI is running through all of this tech and these AIs collide with each other? Or you, as the firm, you have built your own artificial intelligence system. Does it run all these other applications? I think that's what he's getting at. It's certainly where my mind went.
Yeah. There are orchestration tools that have been around for some time. LangChain is one. It's an orchestration tool across different LLMs, AI systems. So we're already seeing the ability to connect all of these within an organization. In my mind, it is no different than where we were 10 years ago as companies started moving into best of breed solutions and then started moving into SaaS and cloud. Ultimately, the company providing the service to the end user is accountable for data privacy, compliance, regulation, availability, security. So even if you are integrating 15 different technologies, some may be on-prem, some may be on the cloud, you have a heterogeneous environment, the company providing that is accountable for the integration, how the products are used, any security risk that one of your providers runs into has to be mitigated and resolved to ensure that you are compliant. So what I think is going to happen is that the relationship between the company consuming 15, 20 different services from vendors is going to have an incredibly sophisticated set of tools to manage not just vendor performance from a contractual perspective, from a security perspective, from a privacy perspective, but in understanding who has residency of data at any given moment and how to ensure that data is resident and proprietary to the company, not to the service provider. And I think that is going to be a complicated and sophisticated set of challenges for large companies to work through, particularly in healthcare, finance, legal, some of the very high risk areas where we start to see AI taking place. If we think about healthcare, potentially literally life or death. If we think about autonomous vehicles, potentially literally life or death. So there are so many areas where those companies are going to be taking on a very significant set of risks as they get engaged in these broader ecosystems.
Fundamental build versus buy equation itself, because presumably if AI costs decrease, why wouldn't Wells Fargo or any other company, even a mid-cap company, take on those costs and build it?
My perspective is, as companies think about their mission, their consumer, regardless of whether they're B2C or B2B, everybody has a consumer. What is the true differentiation that you're bringing to the marketplace? What is your specific value prop to the marketplace? And how do you create that distinguished experience? So what I would recommend is that companies are thinking about how they control and define experiences or how they engage in experiences. Companies will go where people are, and people are on social for the most part. So I can envision a future where, whether it's an entertainment company, whether it's a social platform, I have, as an individual, a digital twin that exists on those platforms, and I am engaging through a set of experiences, some of them entertainment, some of them transactional, financial companies, insurance companies, whatever the company is going to have a set of services that will be integrated through an API. I think the critical piece there is ensuring that your data that is specific to your customer and your service is yours, that you own it. If this is a company's core purpose, leverage that expertise, don't replicate that expertise. So I don't know that it will make sense to have many companies, certainly with LLMs, building those, right? That's a massive amount of compute. But I do think that as companies look at proprietary data sets, small data, many will be developing those internally. The other thing is we are entering this sort of golden age of the entrepreneur, because for those smaller companies that don't have those resources, there's very little need to build them right now in-house, because you can license, you can access all of these models. If I'm leveraging a service, I take on the risk associated with integration across multiple providers, what we talked about just a moment ago, privacy, regulation. If I'm building everything in-house, that's still going to take a significant amount of investment. So I think part of it depends on the size of the organization, the nature of their data, and what domain they're in. Companies really are going to be focused on creating incredible experiences. And creating incredible experiences is about understanding your market, understanding your consumer, and having candidly creative people. And creatives can be engineers, they can be designers, but people that think in those terms, not simply executing from a technical perspective. So I'm always bullish on leveraging what's in the marketplace versus buying or building everything internally. That's my net solution, because it gives you the opportunity then to focus on what really differentiates you in the marketplace.
I think that makes sense. I just wonder, as the economics change, it just seems like it might be coming full circle. Because to your point, if compute is actually less, whoever that's coming from, but at some point, and if energy costs are managed, et cetera, why do I need to go out to the market when I could create something very customized? Because that actually is what it seems to me that a lot of AI tech is basically saying, that if you can customize these solutions for your own organization, it seems like it would be a very fragmented market. For example, Mark Zuckerberg was in the news a couple of weeks ago saying that basically they will get rid of all mid-level engineers by the end of this year. That's an incredibly rapid evolution. And he's not alone in that. In his own quote, he talks about other companies like working towards this. So if any random company can basically replicate all of this code with robots, what are we doing here? Why do I need Salesforce when I can build my own CRM or whatever, right?
But they're still using the framework. They're still using the platform, right?
Sure, but instead of it being like
Salesforce.
tens of thousands of companies, right? If all I need is Anthropic or ChatGPT or whatever, and I no longer need the rest of these tools and tech, doesn't that have huge implications for the market? It seems like it would.
I do think there are significant implications for the SaaS market and what it will mean to go to market, what it means to be competitive. Yes, I think that is going to change, but I don't think that means that people consuming those services will stop consuming them and build everything in-house. The ability to leverage frameworks, platforms is still going to be incredibly important, regardless of how inexpensive the compute gets from an economics perspective. Having a provider manage lifecycle management, risk, versioning control, security, I think will continue to be more effective than every organization building all of them internally in-house. Now, how does the service environment consolidate? How does the SaaS market consolidate? I think that's a different and very interesting question. I do agree that landscape is going to look very different 5 years from now. But to be truthful, we already have dominant players today.
So absolutely.
I don't know that this idea of massive organizations with massive control and dominance in the marketplace will shift. It will be interesting to see if there are smaller services that are targeted to specific consumers, specific domains. And I want to go back to a moment when we talk about organizations really needing to understand what their consumers need and want and how best to serve that and where to meet them. This is another reason I think diversity in an organization is essential. If you do not have people in your marketing, branding, biz dev, strategy, product organizations that reflect the experiences of the consumer that you are selling to, I do think that is a miss.
I think what you're speaking to also really reminds me of the early days of the app ecosystem. I do think that these large players will stay very dominant. What I think might be going away is the people that are like sub-scale, that are large but not gargantuan. And I also wonder and worry a little bit about what new market entrants would do. In the same way that Apple is a gatekeeper, sometimes in very good ways, but nonetheless, they've had a huge lawsuit over many years with Epic about the fairness of them as a toll booth. I wonder if something similar to that might emerge or might be emerging already in this world. It seems like it might be. Part of what we're getting into, and you have spoken to this, but there are huge privacy and security concerns that play into this. And I may not be articulating it well enough when we talk about this interdependence of AI systems and internal tools versus external tools and this whole ecosystem, because there's a lot to navigate. I mean, we're talking about huge issues here. Tell us what you think someone needs to know when they're thinking about privacy and security.
When we're thinking about privacy and security, there are a couple of avenues. Number one, data. Who owns the data? Where is the resident data? And as you start integrating with more platforms and more services that are fundamentally managing data, that's going to be a very complicated topic for companies to answer. Another area is really around security, compliance. One of the biggest challenges for enterprises over the past 10 years as they look at more providers versus building in-house is managing security risks. If I'm a highly regulated organization and I am working with a vendor that is less, what contractual obligations does vendor have to adhere to my compliance? And as those vendors get larger and more power, the consumer, the enterprise may have less leverage to negotiate that. Like that is going to be an increasingly important strategy for businesses to understand as they set up ecosystems involving multiple providers specific to AI.
I think that's super helpful. It's not just the white hats, the good guys using AI. Attackers are clearly already leveraging AI to do more damage, whether they are just your average happy criminal or state actors, non-state actors. And there's just a ton of different threat vectors if you're the CISO or the CIO looking at this. Anything else that you think might be helpful for people to keep in mind as they're navigating this in the short term? Because obviously I realize in the long term, this is very difficult to predict how this might evolve.
So one thing I will share sort of with that, Mel, is I think there is a huge opportunity right now to create a true digital identity, an immutable digital identity. I'm working with a startup that is doing something around this. I think that is going to be an essential way for consumers and for platforms to combat false information, deepfakes, et cetera. So I'm very excited to see what happens in that field. As it relates to bad actors, I think the role of the CISO is going to become one of the most complex, stressful roles in the organization. It is an increasing need for organizations, whether they're small or large. CISOs will now need to be experts in areas that they have not had to consider before. So I think what I would say to any young people watching this, consider that career.
So interesting. What's an example of something that you think CISOs weren't looking at that they might have to now?
I think that there was a lot of focus on reactive response. That's certainly not to say that there was not proactive work going on, but I think the ability to identify and predict issue before it happens and to detect is going to be increasingly important. It is going to be increasingly fraught for us to consider what we put into an application like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini, because we are in a geopolitical environment right now in the US, and certainly this exists in other countries, where personal information will be weaponized against us based on policy. And I think that is going to be a very real issue for populations right now that are under siege, certainly in the US.
Back to the conversation at the top, I think it's another reason that I personally find DeepSeek to be very concerning, because you are giving someone a lot of giving a foreign country a lot of information about you. This also makes me think a little bit of the Gen Z meltdown about TikTok, which I think the Congress did a really just such a strange job of. On the one hand, it passed almost unanimously from the extreme right to the extreme left. Everyone thought that it was something that we needed to ban. And it's not because of just the data. It's because it's also a tool of propaganda. The fact that we just watched TikTok basically rally everyone under the age of 25 to save it should concern people. But we don't do a good job talking about some of this. I'm not saying that American tech companies are angels or perfect. They're certainly not. But we're in a war in a lot of ways. And I don't think that we necessarily recognize that as citizens.
I think a lot of young people, I have a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old, they think very differently about privacy and security and what information they're willing to share and not share, but they also have not had it weaponized against them yet. Yeah. And you think about populations today, whether we're talking about immigrant populations, LGBTQ populations, there is very likely a chance that some of this information will be weaponized. And so I do worry for young people who have not had to operate with this filter. I also just want to comment that TikTok was not saved by 25-year-olds. TikTok was saved because obviously there was a propaganda statement by the president and the president-elect, and then the president and the CEO of TikTok.
No, 100%. It was clearly manipulated by the CEO. And also, hello, it's still in law. It's still coming down unless it's been sold. So there's a whole open question out there. We're going to find out if American laws mean anything. We're about to find out.
Okay, so I love this idea, what the SaaS marketplace looks like. Is there no opportunity for real innovation from new market entrants? I don't know. Or are those new market entrants just going to be gobbled up, get big exits? I think the whole idea around how the enterprise is going to manage this complex set of partners from a data privacy, security, performance perspective. Another area that's really interesting is to talk about critical services like air traffic control, energy grids. How are these organizations leveraging and thinking about security? Because just as much as the bad actors have the opportunity to capitalize on the capabilities of this new technology, I hate the good actors, or at least what we believe is good, also have the opportunity to leverage the same technology to block and think through different ways to look at this.
This has been really interesting as we've had such a wide-ranging conversation in the enterprise. Thank you so much, Tali. We really appreciated having you. I like that we went from very expansive all the way. We've come full circle.
Yeah, this has been a delight. Thank you so much, Neeta.
Thanks so much for listening to Good Revenue. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show, give us a rating, or leave us a review. It helps other listeners find us, and we really appreciate your support. You can also catch full videos and highlights on our YouTube channel.